In this video, we are going to be going over Chapter 3, Geology of the Ocean, and here, of course, are some key concepts that you can circle back to later. So, the world's ocean wasn't always there when the Earth was first formed. So, it's thought that like primitive Earth, early Earth was composed of silicone and iron, magnesium oxide, and other elements. And slowly, as the Earth heated, it caused melting and separation of the different elements based on like their density, and some moving up and some moving down. And some water vapor that was locked away in those minerals basically worked its way to the surface, and it cooled down, it condensed, and formed the world's ocean. Of course, none of us were actually there, so all of this is a hypothesis. But along with that, there wasn't originally an atmosphere around the Earth. Like slowly, as these different processes happened, some different gases were released into the atmosphere, but oxygen specifically, which is really important to our lives, did not start really accumulating until there was photosynthesis, which came around first by bacteria and then, of course, by plants. So early Earth is was cooled and then warmed over time, and its core moved molten iron and nickel into the very core, the center of the Earth, because it was the heaviest and it was the most dense. And then lighter things came to the top of the Earth over time. So to model early Earth and find out where like the first cells came from, there was Stanley Miller and there was an apparatus that was made that tried to take inorganic materials, and here's a GIF of it here, some inorganic materials, and try to replicate various processes like the radiation and heat from the sun, or like volcanic eruptions, or say magma or lightning, and try to model how the first organic molecules like cells were made out of inorganic material. And here's a video by Stated Clearly, what was the Miller-Urey experiment, and you can check that out for more information. But the basics of that was that early Earth didn't have what it takes to make inorganic matter into organic matter. And so we still hold in biology to the cell theory, which states that all cells come from other cells. So where those cells first came from has not scientifically been found yet. So the first cells were most likely anaerobic bacteria, meaning they did not rely on oxygen because, again, that hadn't accumulated in the atmosphere yet. And these early fossils that they have dated to be about 3.4 to 3.5 billion years old were found in West Australia, and they were thought to be the first cells. And here's about what these early anaerobic creatures looked like. Today, our oceans contain about 1.37 billion cubic kilometers of water, which is so much water. And it's divided into different oceans: the Atlantic, which is here, the Pacific, which is huge here on this both sides, is the Pacific, the Indian, which you know, and then the Arctic Ocean at the top, and the Southern, or sometimes it's called the Antarctic Ocean, at the bottom. But crazy, even though we are so advanced in time right now, there are still some reputable sources that say, hey, we have like 4 major ocean basins, and they put that as the Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, and Arctic, and they just have like the Indian, Atlantic, and Pacific absorb what is called the Southern or Antarctic Oceans by some others. So some say 5 major ocean basins, some say 4. So just know that based on whatever source you're looking at, and there's different reputable ones that say either one, that you need to know that for the Cengage Marine Biology book. they're relying on these four. So the Pacific Ocean, either way, is the largest of those, and the Arctic is actually the smallest. Besides that, there's these different inlets called seas that are a lot smaller than oceans, and they're nearly completely landlocked and don't have good flow in the ocean. I've been diving in this one before from Jordan. It's called the Red Sea, and I came in through Jordan and then came out here. But what's interesting is that when you are in something like this Red Sea, you can see, I don't know, 8 or so different countries just by spinning like in a 360-degree circle, because lots of countries all fight over their real estate. They want to be connected to the oceans and different seas, obviously because of the wealth of resources and military advantages that it brings them. So continental drift, the inner core of the Earth, is a solid, dense space made of mostly iron and nickel. Then there is the outer core. This is actually liquid, also made of iron and nickel, but it is less dense, and so it actually flows like a liquid. So this is so dense, it's a solid. This outer core, so inner core, solid, outer core is a liquid. Then above that is the mantle, and the mantle can be broken into the upper and the lower mantle. Obviously, you can see that these two together, when you loop around the whole Earth, is obviously the highest mass, like the majority of the Earth. And this is very magnesium and iron silicates. It's very rich there. And then the crust here, the crust on the outside has two different parts. The lithosphere the lithosphere, I remember it is just something that you like, that's what you walk on. That's what you're planting your plants in and your crops, and you dig a shovel into the lithosphere. And below that is the asthenosphere. But the together, this crust is made of silicate-rich spaces. The oceanic crust is made of silicate-rich materials like granite and feldspar. That is the continental crust, is silicates, granite, feldspar. And the oceanic crust is basalt, iron, and magnesium. In general, the lithosphere right here is less dense because it basically only has the atmosphere above it, whereas the oceanic crust tends to be more dense because it's being compressed by this very heavy water that is above it, that is seeping in, and it just gets very heavy. So continental drifts, and like the idea that once the continents were all joined together, is attributed to Alfred Wegener, who said, hey, maybe these all fit together like a puzzle piece. And if it was, then this supercontinent, we could have called it something like Pangaea, with the upper part being called Laurasia and the bottom part being called Gondwanaland. And over time, because of plate tectonics, it could have separated out into different parts. And in fact, it's still separating in a process called continental drift. So Hess further proposed in the 1960s that it's actually magma underneath the Earth that is heating and cooling in circular movements and moving the different pieces of land to the sides. Occasionally, that magma might break through as volcanoes, but lots of times it doesn't. And so you have things where you have like mid-ocean ridges where the mountain is made by magma that is below the oceanic crust, and you can also have subduction zones, and this GIF will show you that in a second. But this is like the Juan de Fuca plate that hit the North American plate, and you can see as that oceanic plate, the Juan de Fuca plate, pushed on the North American plate, it was heavier, so it went below the continental plate of the North American plate, and it pushed the North American plate up. Well, when it pushed underneath, a lot of it subducted, the Juan de Fuca plate did, and it caused a bunch of like mountains to form. It caused different volcanoes, things like that on the North American plate that you see not only in California where it caused this, but a lot of states like westward can see the effects of that happening. And then in other areas where you have some pushing and hitting each other, you have the opposite, where you have seafloor spreading, where you have two plates that are like separating, and it allows magma to come up through the center of those, because it's like a break down to the deeper in the earth, and that magma can come out and form new land. And so there's all different aspects of continental drift. You can have places like a mid-ocean ridge that has magma coming up through the asthenosphere to the lithosphere, and sometimes breaking through and sometimes not. But this new magma coming in will push to both sides, and you'll have movement of the crust. That's called a divergent boundary, because the two different crusts are diverging from each other. But then somewhere along the way, this is going to push down and deposit sediment, and it's going to go down and subduct and go underneath another plate. And here you can see that heavy oceanic plate subducting under this continental plate here. And sediment will accumulate, obviously, because this is pushing this way, so it's going to deposit some of it. Some of it's going to dive down and become magma, and it will push this continental mass up, which causes different hills and mountains. So this is just another picture of what those convection currents look like. That is the magma getting really hot from the core coming up. Some of it will come up and break through. Some of it will form new land, and some of it will just circle back down when it cools and get heated again. And it'll cause these currents to go to the right and to the left and make new land along the way. So that can on the surface look like a volcano or form a mountain range or a rift valley where there's a rift, and basically that just means a split between the two sides. You can have a fracture zone, and you can start creating new oceanic crust. So does this really happen? Can you see continental drift or evidence that it happens? There's a few different evidences that we can see. You can physically see some places like these rift zones that are forming new Earth. There's also leftover physical evidence of a supercontinent where if you fit these pieces of puzzle together, there's a number of places where the fossil record has fossils of extinct animals that fit together perfectly. There's also different continental boundaries. There's earthquakes. There's temperatures are really hot near these ridges, so you can tell that there's volcanic or like different magma activity going on there. One type of fault is called a transform boundary, and these are when two plates are kind of just like scraping or rubbing past each other as they go in opposite directions. And you can actually have a rip called a rift zone where there's like spreading apart of two pieces of land, and that gives way to other liquids or like magma that can come and fill that in. Also with continental drift, you have what's called the ring of fire, where on certain places on the planet, they've mapped where there are really strong volcanoes or earthquake. Basically, seismic activity happens in these spots. And no shocker, it's right along a lot of plate boundaries is where this happens. And here, like I'm in Southern California, you can see it's very, very bright red there. We are on the ring of fire. So this is a video by ArcGIS, the continental drift from Pangea to today, that shows you how it's speculated that those continents moved. So with the theory of plate tectonics, you can see that there's divergent plate boundaries. Divergent plate boundaries are where two pieces, and this is a really good GIF of that, two different plates are actually pushing apart and they're separate. And because they're actually going in opposite directions, something comes up from down below to fill in the space. So that's like magma that comes in below. And what's interesting is that as it fills in, it will fill in equally on both sides usually and make these like lines that you can see, these stratification along the way. You'll also have some convergent plate boundaries. These are where plate boundaries move towards each other, and as these two come and hit each other, you're going to see one win and one lose, usually, where one kind of goes up and the other one dives down, and it's usually the heavier ocean crust that ends up diving down, like what you see here. So you'll see the oceanic crust dive down, the continental crust tends to win and be the one that goes up and stays up, but it does get buckled and pushed up into these different hills, mountains, volcanoes start to form because this crust ends up going somewhere, and so it'll go down and it'll buckle that or push up to be volcanoes. Interesting, in these same places, you'll end up having in divergent boundaries, and you'll have these rift zones where they're separating apart. But an interesting finding is that, so right now, if you take a compass, and it's a good working compass, the compass should be pointing to magnetic north. It should go north. But the north, magnetic north isn't always magnetic north. At different points in Earth's history, the South Pole has actually been where a compass would point. Okay, so you would have magnetic south at different points in history. An interesting thing is that at these rift zones where new rock is coming out, as it comes out right now at a rift zone, because magnetic north is at the north, the kind of like magnetic materials like iron will actually kind of point or attenuate towards the north. And then there will be a historical record in there where, at a certain point in history, all of the, on either side, when there was actually a magnetic south, all of the very magnetic type of metals that are in there will actually point towards the south. And so you can see these different, and then it gets frozen in time, right? As it cools down, those minerals will actually, metals will actually freeze in that position as they cool down. And so you have a record of magnetic north and south on both sides of this divergent boundary that will kind of like be frozen in time and tell us where, if we were at a magnetic north or south at different points in time. And it'll match on both sides, which is really cool. Okay, so at these rift, a lot of times you'll have these deep sea vents that are releasing a lot of inorganic, non-living material, but very mineral rich places that are coming out from the middle of the earth. But while it's very mineral rich, it's all inorganic compounds. So it's like non-living compounds. Well, there's different bacteria down at these rifts that can actually take these inorganic compounds and turn them into organic compounds that can be used for life, and to have some organic compounds to make to use as food. And so can take inorganic material, use it as food, and eat it. So this does not turn it into cells, they just use it as a food source. Well, there's different worms and tube worms and things like that that will actually incorporate or like have a mutualistic relationship with this bacteria, where they give the bacteria a place to live, and then the bacteria gives them food. And so you can have some very cool, interesting communities that are in utter darkness that are just living off of chemicals down there that exist, which is really cool. So if you were to go and make maps of the ocean floor, you would be looking for bathygraphic features like mountain ranges or canyons or valleys. And you can see here, this would be like a trench, this would be a volcanic island, or a seamount is kind of like a flat looking volcano. Abyssal hill, you can have abyssal plains, the continental slope, or the continental shelf. So this is what you would expect to see when you are looking at a bathygraphic map and what it would look like. So on these ocean bottoms, you will see that there can be submarine canyons. Okay, these are canyons that were cut by water, continental water. So water that was on land, and this is, you can picture it being like the Grand Canyon, but when this ocean was a lot lower. So when this ocean was a lot lower, so a lot of this water was tied up in glaciers and things like that, there were rivers on land that cut these deep canyons, and you'll see these abyssal fans where they fanned out a bunch of their soil and sediment out to there. But now this canyon is just covered up by ocean water. So over time, the glaciers have melted, the oceans have risen, and it has covered up these features that are there. So these features still exist under land. They're just covered now with ocean water, which is cool. So that's called a submarine canyon, an abyssal fan. You see the edge of the continent. And again, this is just the regular continent, and it keeps going, but it's now just covered by some of the ocean. But at one point, it does start to break off or just taper off. And that is called a shelf break at the point that it starts to really go down the continental slope until you end up getting to the sea floor that's there. So those submarine canyons, like an example of a canyon that is now covered up by ocean, but it wasn't, is in New York. They have the Hudson River Canyon that is really an obvious place that goes very deep, but it's just now covered up by ocean. And then an ocean rise is a gentle slope that comes up out of the sediment and onto land. Okay. So some other ocean features that you can see is you can see the deep ocean trenches, you can see little abyssal hills, volcanic mountains. You can see the continental rise is where it just starts to go up, and then the slope is where it kind of steeply goes up. The continental shelf is where it's not very deep yet, but it's still covered in water. A seamount, again, a very flat-ish mountain, and then different islands that'll be there, and plains and hills. Okay, so there's different amounts of life varying based on how deep you are in the ocean. Obviously, the continental shelf that's just slightly covered with water and it gets plenty of sun and tons of runoff nutrients from land, those are highly productive, and we're going to see a lot of organisms there. But then once we go down into the deep like here, like the deep sea floor, you're just not going to see as many organisms. There's no sunlight, so there's no photosynthesis. There's not a lot of runoff at that point. So here's two different videos, one by Geodiode, the continental shelf, coral, plankton, and kelp, that shows you what that looks like, and one video by Geodiode, the deep oceans, abyssal plains, trenches, and their bizarre life. So you can see like a contrast between those two. So the composition of the sea floor, believe it or not, people have classified soil and dirt into different levels. And the smallest version of that is clay. And clay almost feels like just like a mud. It's very, very small pieces of sediment. And just slightly bigger than that is silt. And then sand, you know what that's like when you go to the beach. And bigger than that is a really like grainy sand, like what you would expect to see in a lot of places, like in Hawaii. And bigger than that is pebbles, and then cobbles, and then boulders are really big. But when you break up that different sediment, there are different things. When you look at it under the microscope, not all that sediment is the same. You can have hydrogenous sediments. This is really interesting because this is actually sediment that is formed from different minerals that are in the seawater. So by different processes, this comes together like carbon or phosphorus or manganese nodules that come together and form sediment solids out of their like aqueous forms. And then you can also have biogenous sediments. This is living things that have died, usually that have like a calcium or a silicone type of shell, like coral or mollusks, or corals, mollusks are good examples of that have a hard shell, and now they have passed away, and their shell is still existing at the bottom and has become part of the sediment there. Then you can have terragenous sediments. These are just rocks that are broken down over time, by the water, wind, freezing, thawing, all those different ways. Or even cooler, you can have cosmic sediments that come from outer space and land at the bottom of the ocean. So this is a video by Earth Rocks, Ocean Sediments, that goes over that a little bit more. So when we try to navigate where we are in the ocean, we use different maps and charts. And I love this video by Vox called Why All World Maps Are Wrong. And I could talk to you about it forever, but honestly, I just recommend the visual aid of the video explaining how they tried to make all these different types of flat maps and globes and things like that, and why no matter what you do, all maps and charts are wrong. It's just, it's a really difficult thing to do. Okay. But going back to bathymetric charts, I want to talk about the difference between that. Okay. If you were to look on land and you wanted to show that on land there was like different hills and valleys and different plains, you would use something called a topographic map, and that would show you the different heights and variation of the surface. Okay, so a bathymetric map is the same essentially as a topographic map, but it goes downwards and into the ocean. So topographic maps or topo maps are on land, and bathymetric maps go downwards into the ocean. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, obviously this color here is the land, but here at this line, the 20 degree, the 20 line, it's saying that all of this whole line is about 20 meters or feet deep, and a little bit further out is say like 40 meters deep, and then 60. And then you can see here the lines are super close together, where the first line says 100, but then we're quickly up to 600 and 1,000. Okay, that tells me that these are really close together and jumping from 100 to 1,000, meaning this is where the land takes a steep cliff downwards really, really quickly. And then from 1,000, it kind of levels off to 1,200, 1,300, things like that. And then you can see some other areas here where actually the land starts to come up and it's actually kind of high, which tells me these are little like seamounts or like little underwater mountains that are there. Another version of that is called the physiographic chart, and the one difference between this and bathymetric, okay, this picture is an artist's rendition of what you see here. So this has the exact numbers, but this is an artist drawing it out. Some people prefer the physiographic charts because they really just want to see a picture, and this makes the most sense in their brain, and that's fine. But with the bathymetric charts, I personally prefer this one just because, like, when I see something right here that jumps from 100 meters deep to 1,000 meters deep, I'm not necessarily picking up when I look at this physiographic that it drops by that much. I don't really see the extreme drop there in this artist rendition, but I can see how some people, just might prefer to see a picture. And when you tell them it's a steep drop from like 100 to 1,000, they can just kind of project that in their mind and understand it. But those are roughly the same. Just one goes by the numbers and expects you to imagine it, and one just kind of draws it out for you. Okay, so longitude and latitude are two reference lines around the Earth. With the prime meridian is the reference line right here that goes through Greenwich, England, and it is 0 degrees longitude. From that, if you go 20 degrees east or west on either side of that, you'll eventually go all the way around the Earth completely until you get to the other side, and the longitude lines move in increments of 20 degrees. Separate, the latitude lines start at the equator, which is 0, and then they move up. There's the Tropic of Cancer. If you move up 23.5 degrees north, that is the Tropic of Cancer line of latitude, or if you do 23.5 degrees south, that is the Tropics of Capricorn latitude line. From there, you can go up to 66.5 degrees north for the Arctic Circle, or 66.5 degrees south for the Antarctic Circle, until you get to 90 degrees to the North Pole, or 90 degrees to the South Pole. Okay, so latitude, in other words, will go north or south, and longitude goes east or west. When you're looking at something like these Canary lines, the Canary Islands, the latitude line is listed first and the longitude second. Here's a video by Brain Stuff, How Stuff Works, How Do GPS Coordinates Work, where it will go over that, and you can see the north for the latitude and then the west for the longitude listed there. Okay, so doing all of this navigation, there's a lot of history with that. One of the main tools for navigations that was actually a tool, a lot of people use the stars and things like that, but one of the first tools that gets a shout out is called the sextant, and it basically measured the angle between the horizon and the North Star. And it was first invented in the 1500s, and it is extremely complicated. Here is a video showing called The Practical Navigator Getting Started in Celestial Navigation Using the Marine Sextant. It's very complicated. It's very complicated how this worked. And it made it hard to use. It wasn't that reliable, but other people tried to come along and build something even better. And this is a video by Flickhut, the chronometer invention. The chronometer was invented by John Harrison, and he basically with the British Empire. He was a clockmaker that decided he was going to try to win a prize of, in today's money, it was going to be a couple $1,000,000. And so he spent a lot of time building something that was very accurate for navigation. It took him 50 years. And by that time, when he got it, which it was he eventually made a handheld, like almost watch-sized device, that perfectly worked for navigation at sea. By then, people were like, the prize money is too old. We're not even going to give you the prize money for building this. But eventually he argued to get the prize money, and he did, but it took him 50 years to get there. And so he only had the prize money for a couple years and then died. But essentially, his tool that he invented was exceptionally accurate. But even more accurate than that is today we actually have GPS. And GPS utilizes like 3 different satellites. And the different satellites will triangulate or make like a circle around each one of them. And where the 3 circles intersect, that is your position. And it's very, very accurate. These satellites are all over the place in the atmosphere. And interesting, that triangulation method is also similar to, it's near identical to the method that we use to calculate the epicenter of an earthquake, but we use different like earthquake detection centers that are on land. But here's a video by Brightside, how GPS works today, that you can watch for more information on how that works. So that was chapter 3, the geology of the ocean. I hope you learned a lot new things, and move on to the next video.